Cubase 12 is here. That's probably not a surprise to anybody, particularly after what seemed to be a slip on the Steinberg site late last year let the cat out of the bag. It seems there'll be no 0.5 releases, just whole numbers from now on. And in addition, everybody who's bought Cubase 11 since that time has got a free upgrade to Cubase 12, so that should hopefully keep plenty of people happy. However, that also led to a lot of people thinking that maybe the only thing that was going to be in here would be Steinberg's Activation Manager. But hopefully, as you'll see over the course of this video, the Steinberg Activation Manager is probably the least exciting part of this. There's lots of new features, a couple of big ones, quite a few little ones, and a lot of things which will hopefully make your workflow in Cubase 12 easier. So, with no further ado, let's get into it. So here we are in Cubase, and as you can see, it doesn't look drastically different. There's a few minor changes here and there, but most of it is pretty much what we've come to expect since Cubase 10. So let's get started by looking at the warp markers. So this is the first item, is that warp markers are now available in the project window, amongst a couple of other changes, but we can just pick them here. So as well as the warp grid, so where you've got the time warp tool, you can also pick free warp, and you need to be zoomed in a reasonable amount to see what you're doing here. So that's the first warning. So if you try and do it zoomed out here, you won't see anything happening. So let's just zoom in a little bit. And in this case, I'm going to turn on group editing, so we see that it can be done to multiple tracks at the same time, but we can just grab that, create a marker, and then move it to where we want. So you can see we can do this with multiple tracks at the same time. If I turn that off, you can see that if we wanted to, we could change this. And obviously these are multi-track drums, so that would be a fairly bizarre thing to do, but it's perfectly possible to do that. So really handy being able to do that. It's also possible now to have phase coherent audio warp. So this alters the way that the audio warping is done to keep phase between tracks. So you probably would just want to turn this on if you're doing anything where you've got multi-tracks with stereo imaging, but this is something which is covered in more detail on a separate video elsewhere on the channel, so you can take a look at that. It's also possible to adjust the warp markers of multiple tracks at the same time. So for instance, I can open these up, I can go to free warp, and you'll see, hopefully up here, you'll see that these two tracks, once we zoom in, you'll see that these two tracks will change and those won't. So you can see that I've created this space here, but these haven't changed. So you can pick which tracks you're going to work on and, most importantly, edit them multiples at a time. It's also possible to copy warp markers from one event to another. Take a look at the full video on the channel to see how to do that. Chord events from audio is now possible. So here I've got a chord track for the project. I've also got just an audio mix down of some simple chords. Again, this is one of the areas where I've got a full video elsewhere on the channel. So to see this in detail, you can take a look at that. But here's one of those examples that I used, and I can drag this onto the chord track, and it analyzes it and comes up with what it thinks are the chords for it. And you can edit these in the normal way you would do on a chord track. So if we open these up, we can see that the chord assistant has come up with this, and there are options which it's chosen. So you can choose between these, or just decide that no, it wasn't that. After all, it was actually a D diminished 613 with E flat in the bass, etc. You can edit what you want, but it gives you a starting point. Again, this is covered in much more depth on a separate video on the channel, so take a look at that if that's the kind of thing you're into. So another area on the channel where there's a separate video, which is fairly lengthy because it's quite a deep topic and it's definitely more to be covered on it, is the MIDI remote, which has been added in Cubase 12. So this allows you to create your own remote. So there's two remotes you can see on screen, one of which is present, one isn't. This one is a factory one, which has been created by Steinberg for the MPK Mini Mark III. This is one which I've created for the MPK Mini Mark II, and it allows me to grab the controls on the MPK and just choose whatever I want to play around with. So I can just use these as quick controls, as we'll see in a second, but also we can allocate Cubase functions to pretty much any control. So in this case, I've just allocated play. So you can see that's just started that up and made a horrific noise, which I'll come out in the edit. Or we can change channels. In this case, you can see I'm moving on the top part of the window by pressing the arrow buttons, which are occasionally showing, but you can see that that's working as well. It's really powerful. You can create pretty much any layout you like as a combination of knobs, sliders, and buttons. It uses MIDI Learn to create them, which is fairly straightforward. And also it's possible to edit the controls which you are controlling. So you can take this, we can decide we want to reallocate this. So let's say we wanted to reallocate this button to something different. I can just either pick this button in the real world. So if I press this in the real world, you'll see that button illuminates, or you can double click it and then you can pick whatever feature you want. So let's say we wanted to turn cycle on and off. That's in transport, but I can just search for it here. And we can see, even with my poor spelling, we found cycle, and that's allocated it, and that's done. So that's now ready and saved. And every time I plug in my MPK, it will work like that. So you can see now we can turn cycle on and off like that. I say there's much more to this than that. It's covered in a full video in the channel. Take a look at that if you want to see that in more depth. So another area which has got a slightly older video on the channel was about the Steinberg Activation Manager, which is definitely a work in progress, but Cubase 12 is the first version of Cubase which uses this, and as you can see on screen, it's pretty straightforward. It genuinely has worked reasonably well. There's been a few hiccups where maybe I've needed to sign out. That's probably been the biggest thing, is needing occasionally to sign out and then sign back in to update things such as dates of license expiries, because as you can see, both of these are beta licenses and they have dates when they will expire. My Dorico SE one hasn't got an expiry date, so that wouldn't apply to that. But this is the way things are moving. And again, there's a video elsewhere on the channel. I just found it convenient because I'm often mobile on my MacBook, which only has 2 standard USB ports, and one of those was taken up by the keyboard, one of those was taken up by the dongle, and then I had no room for plugging anything else in. Yes, I know I can have a hub, etc., but this just means I've always got one USB port free, which I didn't have before, and I'm not worried about, oh, I've forgotten the dongle, etc., that kind of thing. So it's really been a non-event, which is really how things should be. Definitely not perfect. There's quite a few things in terms of management of multiple licenses, transitioning, etc., but in terms of actually getting this up and running, it was literally a case of install Steinberg Activation Manager, link it to my Steinberg account by logging in, and it just activating like that. And that was it. It was done. The logical editor has seen some love. So this is an area which I really like. It's the kind of thing, if you spend a bit of time mastering it, it can save you from all the mundane donkey work. And after all, computers really should be about automating tasks that we don't want to do. Providing that's not automating you out of a job, but that's a topic for a different discussion. But anyway, the logical editor has now seen a bit of an improvement in terms of its appearance and the way that it works. So you go now to logical editor and then setup, and you can see it looks a little bit different. It's looking a little bit more Cubase 10, and there are some changes. So in terms of the way the presets are arranged, so we've got now a user presets with earlier presets, etc., already stored in there, and then factory presets, which are a new range of ones. So what they've done is they've moved the old ones, which were in the menus in Cubase. You probably will recognize some of these into there, but the factory presets now are in here, and there are more options in here as well. So I'm probably going to do a video on the changes in this in the future, because there's quite a few new things which are useful, and it's definitely more powerful than it used to be. But anyone who's a logical editor user will find it a little bit nicer to use, and also a little bit more useful, because there are extra things which make it more useful, particularly in terms of selecting events, which is one area where maybe it had fallen a bit by the wayside. It's obviously still not, perfect, but so there's more that it can do than it used to be able to do, which obviously is what we're always looking for with this kind of thing, particularly in a fairly niche function that it seems not a lot of people use, which is unfortunate. In terms of included content, Verve has been included, which is a piano and texture synth available for Halion Sonic SE3. So if you have a version of Cubase which comes with Verve, you'll be able to play this. It's got a nicely recorded piano, some texture synth, and some effects. This is something which, again, I've covered in a separate video on the channel because I felt it needed a bit more of a deep dive. But as we can see very quickly here, we've got a few ways of editing the sound. We've got quite a variety of textures which are available, and we've also got a couple of delays, one for the piano, one for the texture, and a reverb as well. So it's a reasonably nice synth. There's a couple of other nice features which you can check out on the video elsewhere on the channel. As ever with this kind of thing, it's nice to have this content. It's not necessarily a deal maker or deal breaker for me one way or another, but it's a useful piano, which actually I've already used on a couple of things just because it's been quick and easy to get to, and I've got the results I wanted straight away, which is always what you're looking for. So here's a quick example of Verve in action. So here's a Chopin Piano Prelude MIDI file being played on Analog String Machine, which is the first Verve preset which I came across. So I think you get the idea with that. Fades. So this is only a small thing, but there is a video elsewhere on the channel because I think this is super useful. This is one of these sort of quality of life improvements, which just means your programming can be much easier and you can end up semi-automating a task. Most importantly, because you can now set default fades. So we could set this length and that length as being the default for this installation, and then that will always apply. And in my case, I've just set them to a macro, so I can just make sure that every audio event I edit has those default fades applied. And then obviously I will customize them if needs be, but it just saves me so much work. It's unbelievable. ARA is now available at a track level. So instead of the old way of getting the right-click menu up and then going to extensions and then picking whichever one you have installed, you can actually pick it for the entire track. So we can pick here, and in this case, I'm just going to pick spectral layers. And then when I double-click this, it will open up in spectral layers. And that will apply for any events on the track, which is, again, only a small change, but a useful one if that's the kind of editing you want to apply to a given track and not have to worry about keeping or reselecting that, etc. So exporting has been improved in a couple of ways, and the most visible way is it's possible to export selected events. So here we have an example, which is Mark Midwinter's drums, which are used elsewhere on the channel, and I've put a link in the description. I've got them set up in group editing just so I can cut some events out like that. And then I can highlight all of these and then go to File, Export, Selected Events. So here, this will just pick all of my options here. So we've got options in terms of processing, whether there's a tail on there. So if you had something like a reverb as an insert, you'd want to put a tail on there, etc. That kind of thing. You can choose where they're going to go. You can choose custom names, etc. So here I'm just going to call them drums. The scheme is the default scheme, which we can change here. So for instance, you may be familiar with this with group editing, etc. So I'm just going to put event name there as well. So that's going to be drums, hi-hat, etc. And you can pick a location, etc. for where they're going to go. In this case, I'm just going to put them on the desktop on my Mac and then click export. And there you can see those have been exported. They're all the same length. You can see they're all 665K long, apart from the stereo ones, which of course are double that. And that's done. So that makes what can be a fairly tedious task much easier and much quicker. Previously, that would have involved wailing and gnashing of teeth, etc. So it's nice to have that flexibility. VariAudio has seen a little bit of an update here. So apart from the controls changing, which actually is a bit annoying because I can't get all of the controls on screen in the screen capture size I use on my Mac, and you definitely can't fit them in if you're using it in inspector mode, which I think is something that needs to be addressed because you can see there's plenty of space here. Hopefully this will be addressed fairly quickly, but you never know. Anyway, rant over. You can pick a scale for the scale assistant. So you can see at the moment we are in D major. If I change it to C major, Tick show scale notes. So here we can see, if you look at the black and white notes here we're in C major, but you can change them on here. So we can pick, let's say, E major, and you'll see on the right-hand side, those lines will change. And then this gives you an appropriate guide. So if you know that your vocal or instrument line or whatever is in a given key, you can just set the key there, and then you've got a much better visual reference than trying to remember which colors, which notes, etc., fit in the key that you're in. So again, this isn't a massively drastic change, etc., but it's quite useful to be able to do that. There are a couple of new effects which may or may not come with your version of Cubase if you're not running Cubase Pro, so that's one of the things we don't get to find out about too early. FX Modulator is a sequence multi-effects unit with modulation available as well, so it's a pretty useful plugin. There's a video on it on the channel separately to go into more depth, but just a quick look at it. You can see the interface here where we have multiple effects in this case, and you can see the modulation which is happening with them. And if we have a quick listen to this drum track, we'll get the idea. So you can see what's happening with this. You get the idea where we're going. And it's pretty flexible. It's pretty easy to change. But say that's all covered in the video elsewhere on the channel. But we get the idea. You can do plenty of things which are otherwise a fair effort in terms of production. And on this one, on guitar, I've got a preset where I've just taken the pitch shifter out. But again, so you can see we've got some modulation happening there at different time scales depending on which we're looking at there. Okay, so that's definitely worth looking at the video on the channel if you're interested in this kind of thing, but it's a useful addition, and again something which has already found its way into a couple of things because I've just thought, oh, that'll make that easy, which again is the point of this kind of thing. But there's more to it. There's side chaining and MIDI triggering, etc., but that's all covered in the full video. The other effect is Razor, which we can see here, which is originally was called a fast limiter. So you get the idea with this. This is a modern sounding, can be reasonably aggressive limiter. So the display maybe has a bit of a tip of the hat to FabFilter's plugins, because we can see the historical gain reduction, which I think is really useful. It's not necessarily something that you should be using all the time to pick what you're doing, but it's good to see what's happening in terms of ideas of what's going on. So you can see that when we turn this off fast mode, that those releases, for instance, become much more smooth, whereas there you can see it's moving around a lot more, and we can alter the time. So there you can see at 1 millisecond it's changing quite quickly, whereas if you put it to this, it's much more like an automatic gain control than it is specifically a limiter. But there's more to that to be experimented with, etc. So again, this is just a quick overview of the things which have changed in this version of Cubase. So you can take a look at that elsewhere on the channel. Another area is SuperVision has a few new modules. So one of them is the VU meter, which you can see here. It's also been given a Spectrum keyboard, which is pretty useful for equating fundamentals and harmonics to actual notes on the keyboard. And the phase balance of your mix is also visible pretty easily using the phase balance. There's a level histogram, which will show you the distribution of levels in your mix. So obviously, if you've got a really loud mix, it's all going to be at the right-hand end. If you've got something which has got lots of variation, you won't just see peaks in this particular case. You would see things all over the place. The same is also true for having a loudness histogram. And people are becoming more interested in loudness as monitoring of audio becomes more of a thing in terms of streaming volumes and some kind of control of the loudness war, effectively. It's possible to import tempo and time signatures from another project. So previously there was the introduction, which was really useful, of being able to import tracks from a project, which has been something that's just made my life so much easier, because often you need a particular track and you can get everything with it here. You're not just importing the audio and then having to copy the settings or save them as a preset, etc. So that's been really useful. Now, in this window here, you can see if we pick the source tempo and signature, which I'm interested in this case, one of the options is tempo and signature, and you can pick them individually as well, which is pretty useful. So I'm just going to pick tempo and signature because there wasn't anything else in this track, and I'm going to do that. And you can see that the rather Genesis-esque time signatures have been imported, as has the change in tempo. So that's just another thing which works really nicely and is, again, a handy little thing that makes life easier, particularly copying what can be fairly complicated events depending on what you've been doing. Apple Silicon support is something which has been coming for a while, and with Cubase 12, this is supported. Unfortunately, at the time of recording this video, I'm still waiting for my M1 16-inch MacBook to arrive. It's been delayed. I've been waiting nearly 3 months for it now, and it's still not here because, unfortunately, I picked one of those custom order setups which isn't off the shelf, and now we're seeing that due to the chip shortage, etc., that those delivery dates are just moving further and further into the future. So I'm sure it will turn up at some point, but at the moment I'm still waiting, so I haven't been able to do any testing of that. As soon as I get a chance, I will do, but I know that it definitely hasn't been plain sailing because it's not as easy as just pressing the button marked compile for Apple Silicon and then everything works, because modern processors are immensely complicated, and scheduling things such as audio processing, which works in pretty much real time, is a difficult problem to solve. So it's been a slightly rocky road. Hopefully we'll see the true performance potential of the M1 processors in all their guises taken care of in the new versions of Cubase, but there will be limitations. So you will need, if you're using it in native mode, you will need plugins which are running in native mode. I don't think it's possible to run Rosetta plugins while you are using Apple Silicon, and it only supports VST3 plugins. So yeah, that's where you'll be at. But VST3 clearly is going to be the future, because VST2 will be discontinued in the next couple of years as well. So unfortunately, if that's news to you and it's bad news, then I'm sorry to be the bringer of bad news, but that's the way everything is going. So, yeah, unfortunately, that will be goodbye to some old favourites, but there we go. In addition, there's lots of tiny changes, which are the kind of things that may not be mentioned in here because the video would be much longer, but it's worth checking out the release information, because there's things such as new nudge cursor commands, which are useful if you want to set up macros for making specific edits, whereas previously they weren't available. It was a bar or frame, etc., that kind of thing, which made it much more complicated. So some of these changes are just been shown on screen because they are too numerous to go through, and it would make for a much longer overview. But they're the kind of things that if they're the thing you're looking for, then they will be really useful. So hopefully this video has given you a chance to get an idea of whether Cubase 12 has got something to offer you and make you make the jump to upgrade. For me, the thing which has been the most useful is probably the most mundane, with the preset fades. It saves me at least an hour a week, and it's an hour a week of work that is just boring and mundane. So I'm freed up to do much more creative things now, which is good. There are obviously much bigger ticket sort of names there. So there's the MIDI remote, Chords from Audio, FX modulator, Verve, and the Apple compatibility. Now, all of those, it's definitely a horses for courses thing. Some people are going to upgrade Cubase anyway, regardless. They would buy it, you know, even if it just changed the number. Some people will be on very old versions of Cubase and perfectly happy because there's nothing there for them. But I think there's plenty of people who are somewhere in between. And if a particular killer feature appears, then that'll be the time that they make the jump. Obviously, there's going to be a lot more people going straight to Cubase 12 because of what happened with the Cubase 11 website issue late last year. But apart from that, there will be people who this is the first thing they've heard about it. Hopefully this has given you a chance to get an idea of whether or not it's right for you. And please watch the other videos on the channel on anything, because there's plenty more depth there. None of them are actually long enough. They probably could be 2 or 3 times the length in some cases, because there's so much to cover. I've definitely not covered everything in this video. The release document is really long. There's plenty of changes which have been made, and some which were going to be made and then maybe didn't make it to the final release. But as ever, I hope you found this video useful, and if you have, please like, subscribe, comment, etc. And we'll see you again soon for more Music Tech Tuition.